Lights, camera, action. We have Ellen Kuras. Yay!
Hey, Charlie.
How fabulous. Let's start with right now. Rather than, I don't want to go back and dig deep into into history. We'll go there, but I'd rather start with what you're up to right now and what's going on. And you were just telling me about the thing that you're about to do with Spike. Tell me about that.
Well, right now I'm currently directing a series for Shonda Rhimes, which is called Inventing Anna, here in New York. And I'm really happy to be here in New York because I haven't been home since mid-June, because I've been directing a lot. And oftentimes it takes me away. And also I'm working with Spike on filming American Utopia, which is David Byrne's Broadway play. So that is an incredible performance, incredible work that David has done, following up so much of his life work. And it's really important work, and I'm really happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So, and then, and with, this is your first time working with Shonda, or you've worked with Shonda before?
No, this is my first time working with her.
Yeah, because it was just over the weekend, I was with Oliver Bokelberg, who did Scandal with that group, yeah.
Yeah.
So he had mentioned, and I told him I would be here with you. He said, "Oh, say hello to Ellen." Yeah.
Well, I've done quite a bit of
Yeah.
Netflix work now. I first started with Ozark, and I've done now 2 seasons of Umbrella Academy as a director. So it's a different world. It's a different approach. I mean, it's a different world of cinema now, and the different kinds and forms of cinema that are happening. The episodic TV world has certainly changed tremendously. I mean, when I was a DP, I remember thinking I would never do TV, and I didn't. I stayed in the movie world very much so. I would do different films, but they were always films. And things have changed now. And when I actually had been asked to do a pilot on a TV series, it was about 3 years ago, and I said, well, I don't have time to do it. They asked me if they could take me to dinner and pick my brain about the ideas anyway, because they knew that I understood a lot of it conceptually. So I did that. I went to dinner and I basically talked for 3 hours about what I thought, the series could be, what it was, and then they turned around 6 months later and they asked me if I would direct 2 episodes. So that's how I got into directing episodic television. I had been directing commercials before that.
Right. So you went from having your life be all about cinematography to directing, and the first thing you were directing was repeatedly doing commercials, and then you got an opportunity to do episodic, and that was it.
Well, actually, if I step back, I actually started as a director way back when, in the middle 80s, when I was doing a master's degree at night at NYU. I was working in the film industry. I was working as an associate producer and working in the editing room, and I started going to school at night because I wanted to get my master's after I went to Brown University for my undergrad.
Right, and in Brown you studied semiotics and anthropology, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And I knew I wanted to be a filmmaker, so I started. I went to was doing classes at night, and I had to eventually do a thesis film. So for a thesis film, I had an idea. I was directing this film. I hired a cinematographer, and I didn't know anything at the time. I mean, I knew nothing really about putting together a film. But I hired this cinematographer, and I sat with him, and I told him about the kind of ideas that I was looking for in this film. I wanted to make a documentary film that was a fusion of documentary and fiction. And nobody at the time was doing that. It was kind of an idea of how I could create a story, a poetic story in the spirit of the truth. So, creating elements that would contribute to the story, but which would be fictionalized and fabricated. And so I was trying to explain to him what I wanted, and we went out for 4 days and we shot. And when I got the dailies back, which I was looking on film, this is a time when you have Steam back.
All film, yeah.
Looking at the dailies, and I thought, they're nice-looking dailies. They look good, but there was something missing. I thought, what is it that's missing? And I didn't really understand it at the time, but I realize now is that when I picked up the camera and I said, I need to find out what that is. what is it that isn't working for me in these dailies? What am I looking for? So I picked up the camera and I started trying to create stories with the camera. And I realized later on that that's what it is. I was trying to create meaning with the image. I was trying to make the image be a metaphor for what the story was. And that kind of has been the guide for my entire life as a cinematographer and as a filmmaker. So that's how I became a cinematographer, because I started shooting. I started shooting my own film. Then people saw what I did, and they started asking me to shoot. So I started really exploring the medium in a different way.
And how did you come across doing Serra in the documentary in Cambodia? How did you, because was that after NYU or?
Well, I at the same time, I started making my film, which is about Laotian refugees in Laos.
Which I've seen. That's the one that you showed at Jarmusch, right?
Exactly,
Right.
The Betrayal.
Right, The Betrayal,
Which I ultimately got nominated for it. I got an Academy Award nomination, and I won the Primetime Emmy for it. But that was only years and years later, because so I started doing this film, and in the process of my doing research, I met this person whose name was Ellen Bruno, and she was working for the Cambodian Women's Association in New York, and I knew she knew a lot of people in Thailand. Make a long story short, I went to Thailand to go do some research and couldn't get into the Laotian refugee camp because the conditions were so bad. So I went into the Cambodian camp, and I ended up hanging out with all the traditional medicine men. I found it so fascinating where the East met the West, where there were traditional medicine men working and diagnosing their tiger epilepsy and have all these potions sitting in front of them that look like green gook, and then dealing with the Western doctors. So the French had set up this program in the refugee camp, which for me was a paradigm of how the Cambodians could be really treated, because they don't have a traditional view of their bodies. So I came back. I took a lot of pictures. I wasn't even filming at the time. I took a lot of pictures and did a lot of video recording, a lot of audio recordings. I came back and I went to this person, Ellen, and I said, listen, let's make a film. I want to make an instructional film which would help the doctors to understand these people and how the worldview. So it was very much about worldview, and that's where my anthropology comes in.
Of course.
Of understanding people from the inside rather than putting my own opinions on it. So we ended up making this tape, and it went all over the country. And 2 years later, right after that, Ellen decided she wanted to go to film school because she wanted to become a filmmaker because of that. She went to Stanford. So she had to do her thesis film, and I said to her, why don't you go to Cambodia? If anybody could get into Cambodia, you could. Because at this time, it was 1985. And the war had ended. Pol Pot was still in Cambodia, and it was very dangerous. But I knew that she had worked on the border, she'd be able to get in. And it would be the first film crew inside the country since Pol Pot. So she took my advice. She got permission. And as it turned out, I recommended the guy that I had been assisting for. Documentary filmmaker, documentary cameraman, really great. And he was going to go, and I, wasn't going to go. I mean, she wasn't going to bring an assistant. So what ended up happening is 3 weeks before they were supposed to leave, he dropped out. And that's when I stepped up and I said, look, I want to do this. And she said, well, you've never filmed a documentary before. I said, well, yeah, I have. I've been filming my own film. I mean, you've seen that. And yeah, but this is a real documentary.
Just to hit freeze frame there, you had already, at this point, you had already studied at NYU, or you'd already been through the program?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't done my thesis project.
But
so
you were in the master's program at that time?
No, I wasn't in the master's program because I was just taking independent classes.
You were taking classes at NYU?
Right.
But so you were studying at that time?
Because I was working at the same time, so I was taking my classes whenever I could. So I was supporting myself in New York. So I didn't go to the regular program. I mean, I could have, but I decided not to.
Right.
So.
And this happened while you were in that.
Exactly. I was in New York. I was working, and I saw this opportunity because I knew the people. I knew the Cambodians from when I lived in Providence. They lived in my neighborhood because I lived in a really bad part of Providence after I graduated because I was working at a museum, and I knew really well the people there. And so I said, I know these people. I know I can do something meaningful. And she said, but you don't have a camera. I said, well, okay. So then I called everybody I knew. I called all the people I knew in France because I had lived in France for a year. And as it turned out, fate would have it, the next weekend, I was at a small gathering of some filmmakers, and I was asking people, I need to find a camera. Because at that time, cameras weren't everywhere. I mean, to have a film camera was a very unusual thing. People would have Bolexes.
And you were getting a 16 camera that could shoot sync. And
exactly.
So it was like an Eclair probably, or an Eclair NPR, ACL.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or, at that time, the Arri SR2s had just come out. They were brand new. And so so I asked around, and somebody said, oh, go talk to that guy. He's an equipment broker. So I went over to him, and he says, yeah, well, as a matter of fact, I have a brand new Arri SR2, which a company had bought, and they only used 3 times because they went to 1-inch video. So I asked everybody I could, my parents, my relatives, and I borrowed money, and I bought this camera. And that changed my life because I had the means to be able to film. So I went to Cambodia with Ellen, and I have to say, it was really quite a challenge for me because the second day we were there, and we were very heavily monitored by the authorities, and I basically had to bribe the guy who was assigned to watch over me to make sure I wouldn't film bridges or any kind of security things. Because remember, this is a time where Cambodia is in a shambles. It was destroyed. And the Vietnamese were there, and he was a Vietnamese operative, and they took us to the killing fields. And in a way, this was a propaganda move to show how the Vietnamese had saved Cambodia. So they took us to the killing fields, and literally, it was as if I had just walked into Dith Pran's life. There were still holes all over the ground, and you could see bits of people's wardrobe, and they had, taken whatever bones they could find and put the shrine together.
Oh my God!
So you have the skulls with pieces of cloth around their eyes, and I thought to myself, I had my light meter, and I didn't exactly know how to read it, and I thought, please God, just help me. I just don't want to fuck this up. I have to tell this story. It's so important to tell this story from my heart.
And you're working, holding handheld, right? I mean, handheld and roving, and you have a sound mixer with you recording sound. And
we had a sound mixer, right? And she had brought an assistant who she knew from school when at Stanford. So we were a very small team, and I would go out myself with a guy who was on one of those bicycles, and I would put on, which was a kurmal, which was one of the scarves, and before I would tell the minder, I would say, oh, I'm going in to take a nap, and then I would sneak out the back door, and I would go out and film by myself, which was insanely dangerous. But, I would go out because I wanted to shoot things that they wouldn't let me shoot. And
like verite moments, right? On the street?
Verite moments where I was unmonitored. And I have to say, it was a trip that really stuck with me for a very long time because you feel the pathos and the resonance of the people we went to, the prison tool slang. We were one of the first people to go there. And, there they had made it into a memorial, makeshift memorial, but it was still pretty much almost left the way it was when the Pol Pot left. And, I mean, from what I understand, it's very different now. But, I mean, it was so real when we were there. It's almost like they had just walked away from the torture.
So you're shooting 400-foot loads and going out and capturing MOS secondary images and synchronous audio footage with and you're doing interviews and live verite and all of that. And the film is going from there somewhere, right? Is it getting shipped back to New York or to London or to a lab in Asia?
Well, that's a really part of the story because while we were filming, we went to a hospital and we we filmed some of these victims who were part of this bombing, part of the Pol Pot bombing. And the Vietnamese government did not want to show what was happening inside of Cambodia. So we had to hide the film. And we were in a hotel, which was called the Samaki Hotel. And we were the only Americans there. There were only 3 Americans. And all the rest were Russians, right? So it was Russians, Vietnamese. And we had to hide the film so that they wouldn't come into the room when we were gone and steal it. So when we left the country, we really were on a prayer that we could leave with all of this footage that we took.
Unbelievable.
So then when we got back to Thailand, it's a whole other story, because we went to Ellen's friend's house. We had it in 2 coolers, and we decided we would go down to the south for to go to what was called Koh Samet, which was basically at that time, it's a big resort now, but at that time it was just a beach and some huts. So she went down by bus, and I was going down with the sound person by motorcycle. Right, so we get on this motorcycle and we start driving an hour and a half south of Bangkok, and we passed by the new Nike factory, which had just been built, the controversial one, which is making all of these low-cost sneakers. And 3 girls ran across the road, and they ran right in front of us. And so the driver, my sound person, had no recourse but to slam on the brakes, and I went over the top of the bike. So it was all. They thought that one of the girls had gotten hit when actually I had gone over the top of the bike. Long story short, I got taken to this clinic and then a hospital. They sewed me up. I mean, I was, had lacerations everywhere. We had to get the girl a CAT scan. They confiscated our passports, the police, until we made sure that this girl was okay. And I was like, of course, we're going to make sure she's okay. But they took our passports and everything because they took the bag from me because I had been wounded. And then we got back to Bangkok like 2.5, 3 days later. So I walked into Ellen's friend's apartment, and the maid who was there took one look at me and she said, "Oh my God, what happened to you?" And I said, "Oh, I had a little accident." So I said, "But I have to get my bandages changed." So we went to the little local hospital where the diplomats would go. And I had been there before we left because I had to send the sound person home with tonsillitis. So he had to go back to the States. So I walked back into that hospital, and the woman doctor, looks at me and she says, "Oh my God, what happened to you?" And I said, "Oh, I had a little accident." And she goes, lay down on the gurney. So I lay down on the gurney. They take me in, and it turns out I have sepsis. They immediately they rip out all of the stitches with nothing, no painkiller, no nothing. And they admit me into the ICU because I had sepsis. And I would have died if I hadn't gone there to get my bandages changed. Anyway, I was in the hospital for 2.5 weeks. I almost had to get skin grafts. I mean, this whole deal. And of course, I did not tell my mother.
Oh my God, what
but
a story.
My worry was what happened to the film.
Yeah.
Because the film was sitting in a refrigerator back in Bangkok.
Okay.
Right. So we took the film out. And of course, I had my leg in a cast and my arm in a cast because of all the wounds that I had. So I was in a wheelchair, and we were carrying this film. So I was carrying film on my lap. We had 2 coolers that we were carrying, that Ellen and the other person had to carry back. And so we got back, and they sent it to Alpha Cine.
Oh, wow.
And the film was fine.
That's out at the one out west, though. That's in Seattle. Yeah.
Exactly.
I think that's where Gus Van Sant used to work.
Exactly.
That's
where I did Swoon.
Oh, you
actually.
did? You worked out of there for Swoon.
Swoon,
oh, wow.
Yeah, that's where we processed Swoon because they did black and white.
That's right. Right.
So the only last story I want to tell about Cambodia that really affected me was that one day we were driving along, and there was a little girl who was on the side of the road, and she was kind of half in a rice paddy. And I go, "Stop, stop, stop." And I jump out of the van with the camera on my shoulder, and I kneel down as if I'm going to shoot her, right? And all of a sudden, she sees me. She drops down on her knees and puts her hands up like in a prayer, like, "Don't shoot me, don't shoot me." And it flipped me out.
Of course.
Because she thought the camera was a gun. She thought it was a bazooka or something. And I immediately put the camera down and I said, I can't shoot you.
Oh my God.
I was like, I put her down and I put my hands
Outrageous.
up like, don't worry, don't worry. And that freaked me out. And I thought, that is what war is all about.
Absolutely. So now a little flip, because you were, when you were at Brown, I didn't know that you spent a little time at RISD. Did you do anything? You did
I did. I took classes at RISD.
Was
in
it
film.
all simultaneous while you were at Brown, or
Yes.
yeah, in tandem? Yeah.
Yes, that's actually how I came to photography, because when I went to Brown, I had always wanted to go to art school, but my parents were like, "You're not going to art school. You need to get a liberal arts education or get an education." My father was an engineer, so I went to Brown. I was really interested in history, ancient history, languages, the ancient world. And so I started studying Egyptology and the ancient world. And my second year, I discovered that I could take classes at RISD because I had a cooperation with Brown, and I could get credit for it. So I could take 2 classes a year. So I wanted to be a sculptor when I was a kid. So I tried to get into a sculpture class, and there was no room. So I took a photography class, and that hooked me.
But the bug for that did not exist growing up in New Jersey as a kid, right?
No, I
You
wasn't
didn't-
exposed to any.
That's what I'm saying.
photography.
That's what I'm asking. And the fascination with film or wanting to be a visual artist was not in your life before that turn that took place to study photography and
Well, it was.
yes.
Yeah, because my father used to build things all the time in the basement, and I used to help him. But I wanted to be a sculptor, so I was always making things
Making
in
things. Yeah.
the basement. Sculptural things. I was constantly making things, and so that's why when I got to RISD, I was really interested in blowing glass. And
Wow.
there's a very famous glass blower who was there at the time teaching. His name is Del Chilly. And he was also giving classes, and I couldn't get into that class. So it was by fate that I couldn't get into these 2 classes.
That you
I
ended
had
up as a visual artist.
I started in photography.
And you were not in Brown at the same time as Todd and Christine, who also went there, right?
I was.
you
I was
were?
before them.
You were
I'm
a little
year
older
ahead of them.
You're ahead of them, yeah. Because when I remember when I was talking to Christine, I didn't realize that both of you studied semiotics.
Yeah, well,
'Cause-
I
yeah.
studied semiotics in France.
Oh, you didn't do that at Brown. Okay.
Because I went to France. After that second year, after in photography, when I was totally in, I became really interested in the image and how meaning is created with the image. Like, why do some images have impact on you and others don't? What is that all about? What is that about perspective? What is that about the subtle inner meanings, the kind of the metaphors, the layers of meaning that go into an image or into a film at this point, that impact you as a person or us as a people, or what makes it universal, what makes it personal.
Did you take any film classes at Brown?
No.
No.
There wasn't really any film classes. There was no
No film
semiotics
or
department.
no film history or any of that. Yeah.
No, I took art history.
Art history.
And I took a lot of English classes, but there was no film classes. There was no semiotics department. So I went to France
Right.
because a friend of mine told me about this program that had started in France, which was called the Centre Américain d'études du film, which is the American Center for the Study of Film, which actually Brown had a part of, which
Was
I
it
didn't know.
in Paris, the Sorbonne,
Paris.
or where? Okay, yeah.
Not part of the Sorbonne, it was part of the University of
University
Paris.
of Paris. Okay.
But it was a very small seminar-based program. So there were only about 15 of us or 12 of us in the program. And most of those people were master's and PhD students. I was, an undergraduate, junior in university. And all of the classes were in French. So we were studying with the guys who were writing for Cahiers du Cinéma,
Cahiers du Cinéma.
right?
Yeah,
Raymond Ballor. I took a class. Lacan was very famous at the time. I took a class with Levi Strauss, believe it or not, who was at the University of Paris.
Wow.
So it was a really interesting time, and it was when Beaubourg was just finished being built.
So the
And layout.
Centre Pompidou, the
Centre
big
Pompidou.
yeah, beautiful.
I was there when they were putting the stones in the plaza in front, right? And so I went to, there was a first photography gallery opened right in front of Pompidou, which was the Gallery Zabriskie. And I walked in there and I said, I want to work here. So here I was working in this gallery, and, there were original Diane Arbises for $300, being
On
shown
exhibit,
there.
yeah.
And I just immersed myself in photography at the time. So I was very much about still image, but also in France, so much of what I studied was not the practical aspect of it. So much of what I studied was the theoretical aspect of it, was Freud and Lacan. It's about what's the real underlying layers of this, which still influences my work now when I think about, what makes you empathize with something. I have a great deal of, I shoot with my heart, so to speak. And so I'm always trying to understand what the emotion is and how I can best tell that story.
Yeah, and with Jung, you have the symbols of the all of the study of symbol of the male and the female and the archetypes, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. That's pretty heady stuff.
Yeah.
But when you get to just, thinking about it less theoretically, so to speak, and you think about, oh, well, how can I make this more universal that people can relate to? Then that's where that starts to apply.
Right.
So I studied for a whole year in France, and I didn't travel like everybody else did when they go to Europe. I basically sat in a library for an entire year.
And immersed yourself.
Yeah, because I had to speak French. I had to learn how to speak French fluently, and because all the classes were in French.
That's amazing, wonderful. And had you studied? You hadn't studied French before that, or you had not really?
Just
a little bit?
minorly, but you don't really learn until you go someplace.
Yeah. No, I grew up in Belgium as a
Yeah.
kid, so we had to speak French there. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how you know. And
That's
you
how I know.
hear it,
Yeah.
and you hear the intonation of the language. And so anyway, so I got back to Brown the following year. And so I heard that they had opened a semiotics department. And so I went to the professor who had started this program, the department, and I said to Silverman, I said, listen, I've just studied with all the people who've written the books that you're using. I want to get credit for this. And I showed him all my papers, and I showed him all my, my recommendations.
work,
and
yeah.
so he gave me credit for that. So, because I had done a ton of work, more than you would have needed to get a degree at Brown. So they gave me credit for that. And then I decided I would take social anthropology, not cultural anthropology. I was really interested in colonialism and the effect of colonialism on indigenous people, but also was really interested in how people relate and economically, socialism and communism. I was really interested in social structures. So in thinking that I wanted to become a filmmaker by that time, or photographer and filmmaker, I thought, I need to know what this is about. I could study the craft of filmmaking and come out of school and not know anything what I want to say. So that's what I tell students. I said, well, it's great to be able to study the craft of filmmaking. You can pick up a camera and shoot, but what is it you're going to say with that is what really counts.
Yeah, no, you have to communicate exactly, and be able to experience culture and traditions and the emotion, right? Yeah. So you've worked with Rebecca, with Spike, with Michel Gondry, and there are so many stories to tell. But I would love to hear you talk about, especially going back to when you first met Michel and got involved with him and working on Eternal Sunshine, which was the first. Was that the first film actually you did together, right?
Yeah, Eternal was the first film that I did with Michel. And I met Michel through Anthony Bregman, who's a producer that I've known for a long time here in New York. And he called me up one day and he said, he said, Ellen, well, now he says that in Michel's accent. And he said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I just finished. I don't remember what film I was doing because I was shooting a lot of films at the time. And also on the side, working on that film that I had started because I hadn't given up that film. I couldn't finish the film at the time because Laos was a completely closed country. It was communist. They wouldn't let me in. I couldn't get the material I wanted. And everybody's like, well, when are you going to finish that film? And I was like, I can't finish this film because I can't make the film I want to make. And, editors would try to get me to cut it in a very traditional documentary way. And I said, I'm not doing it. I'm not going to take all the words and cut the words together and put the images to the words. That's illustrating it. I said, they have to work hand in hand. The images have to speak just as much as the words. And in fact, I almost wanted to make a film that had no words, but, I wanted to tell the story. So I kept on working on the film on the side and going to film the family in Brooklyn. But at the same time, I was kept on just shooting a lot of films. And so when Anthony asked me about Michel, I mentioned Michel to my commercial agent, Robert, who's still my agent. And Robert was like, oh, yeah, I know Michel Gondry's work really well. He does a lot of music videos.
Yeah.
And I had known some of his work, but I really went and looked at his work. And I was like, oh, my God. I mean, Michel is very much about ideas and conceptual approaches to time and space. But he wasn't very interested in what it looked like. I mean, some of the stuff looked like, oh, God, it looked like it shot on VHS. And I thought, I was like, all right, I don't know if I want to work with this person. But so then I said, well, I'll meet him. So we ended up meeting. We went in and I brought some books of things that I thought would be interesting in terms of, how to make Kate disappear. Because the whole story of Eternal, of her constantly eluding, becoming erased, and Jim trying to chase her, I was thinking about different ideas about how we could do that and execute that. And so I met Michel, and Michel asked me to do the film. And so it was very interesting because he was really very concerned in the very beginning with the transitions, meaning the technical, the craft of how to get her to disappear. The trying to figure out ways in camera to make this happen. And I think we connected in many ways because very early on when I first came to New York, which was in the early 80s, I was really interested in experimental filmmaking. So I would go to places like the Collective for Living Cinema,
Right.
and different places that would show,
The anthology.
the anthology film archives,
Right.
which I think is still around.
Still there.
Yeah.
Jonas Makis.
Yeah, Jonas Mekas, who just died this past year.
That's right.
Who was doing really interesting conceptual kind of work, and I've always been interested in the conceptual. So.
Stan Brakhage, all those guys.
Yeah,
right?
all of those guys.
Yeah, right.
Experimenting with what is a film, and so when, coming to Michel, I understood that a lot of what the kinds of things that he was playing with was, the illusions of film, the illusions of how to make something work. I mean, in when film was first discovered, there were a lot of magicians who were using film to create their illusions. And so, I was very interested in that too. So we ended up talking a lot about that kind of thing. So always, whenever I would do a film, I would say to the producers, I will only do this film if I can have the director for 4 days. Meaning, I want the director by myself for 4 days so I can talk about what the meaning of the film is. Because it's not only about the shots, it's about what the intention is behind what they want to say. So Michel and I he came to my house for 4 days. And for the first 3 days, we talked about, these little gimmicks about how to do in-camera kinds of things and that kind of thing. And finally I said, on the 4th day, I said, Michel, we have to start talking about the story because we're only on page 3. So, so, that's the important thing is that it goes hand in hand. So Eternal Sunshine was an interesting game, I would say, because we were constantly figuring out these riddles. And the way I approached it was I thought, okay, I'm going to handhold both cameras because Michel wanted to go in the direction that was completely opposite of human nature. So his other film. So Human Nature was highly structured. The lighting was highly structured. It was all inside on the stage. It drove him crazy. So he wanted everything with Eternal to be organic. It would say organique. It has to be organique.
And that scene on the beach, right? At the bed, and yeah, it's like,
Right.
oh my God.
Well, that's something about the illusion
Right.
of when you're in memory. So when you're in, so that was the idea that we were playing with. When you're in your mind, you can go anywhere. Anything can happen. So juxtapositions can happen. Day turns into night, or you can find yourself, like Kate looks around and all of a sudden she's in bed in the beach. And so those are the kinds of things that we captured in terms of the film actually was a pastiche. It was a metaphor it was meta. It was what it was. So we showed that kind of sudden realization or that sudden jump to another reality. And that's what happens in your mind. So we could go anywhere. But, we had to come up with an idea about how to show looking into the mind, right? So
And getting that feeling, right? That giving the audience that journey, right?
right.
Right.
So I came up with this idea that we need some sort of way to light it so that we could show we're in the mind. And Michel and I, we worked well together because he would show me something and then I would think of something. So he showed me this one film clip it was a French film, and it was of a car driving on a country road. And all of a sudden the car makes a turn against this embankment. And I was like, okay, great, I get it. I said, what we need? We need to have a memory light. So we need to have it's almost like when you look into the tunnel, it's like the light at the end of the tunnel, right? That's where you only, in your mind, you don't see everything all the time. Sometimes you see selective things. So I said, why don't we use a selective light? So I was using different lights for the memory light, a bicycle light, sometimes a park hand outside, but it was a light that in a way was just showing certain parts of the image, like you only see certain parts of your mind.
Right. So you were able to effectively add and subtract in the frame by making the focus on the way that the light hit.
Yeah, wherever the light was is whatever
You were
see.
painting the frame.
Right.
Yeah, with the light. Yeah.
And it enabled me to be pretty loose too, because Michel didn't want to use any film lights. So that was another challenge, because again, he wanted to go completely in the opposite direction of human nature. So I had lights, I lit it. I mean, I had to hide lights everywhere so he wouldn't see them, so I had little refrigerator bulbs and, was hiding them behind lamps, and we'd cut holes into lampshades and things like that. So,
to make it all practical. Right.
As
Almost,
much as
as much
could.
as you could. Yeah, of course. Yeah. And then I think about, and when I think about experimental and what you did and pioneered working with Spike on Summer of Sam and He Got Game and specifically Summer of Sam with the cross processing, right? And creating the being able to work with going back and forth, right? Because was that all reversal? I can't even remember. It was a long time. It was partly though. You just shot certain stuff.
Yeah,
that was cross processed. Yeah,
cross processed to great expense because at that point, reversal film and cross processing was expensive. But in the very beginning when we started prepping Summer of Sam, which was the summer of 1977, basically, it was during the summer, and Spike goes, Ellen, I just wanted to look hot. I was like, okay. And it's like, but I knew that Do the Right Thing was also during a really hot summer. And when I looked at Do the Right Thing, I knew I didn't want to do the same thing as Ernie Dickerson did. who shot Do the Right Thing, and did a great job. But I knew I didn't want to follow Ernie. I wanted to create a new way of looking at it, and
this is before Spike worked with Malik on Girl Six and Clockers, right? Or was
post Clockers.
It was post Clockers.
This is right after Clockers.
Right.
Which is,
So
Malik,
which was already using reversal and cross processing, right?
Exactly. So Malik and Spike had come up with the cross processing, which was brilliant.
Yes.
And that's first how I came into it. So of course, I was like, "Ooh, this looks really cool," because at that point we were not, weren't doing any kind of digital intermediate.
No.
This is way before digital intermediate.
I was in
in film. So
I was in the lab watching the dailies with Joey V. So
yeah. Exactly.
From
you had to, whatever you got
physically
on film was what you got, right?
Prints being made.
Yeah, so you had to think about, how are you going to do that? Some cinematographers would, put their film in the oven and cook it and that kind of
Bob
thing,
Richardson.
or whatever you're going to do. So actually, I thought Summer of Sam, and I remember those summers in New York, in the summertime, in August, it is humid. And it's so humid that the air is so heavy. That to me is New York. So I thought, I'm going to make it feel humid. So that's what I did. So I had to, instead of making the blacks really black, I had to make them really milky. And, of course, in cinematography, it was like, oh, you can't make your blacks milky. And I was like, well, watch me, because that's the way reality is. So Joey V and I did a bunch of tests on how we could fog the film either after shooting or before shooting, because I tried to do it in camera and I couldn't do it because there's a device where you'd put it in front of the lens, which was
Panaflex.
What was it called? Lightflex. Yeah.
Lightflex.
Yeah.
Where it would flash the negative inside the camera.
It would be in front of the camera. It was like a filter. And there would be a light that would go through the filter.
Right.
But because we were doing a lot of nights, we had 6 weeks of nights.
And flashing just to go into it lowers the contrast.
Right.
Right, which was where you guys were going with the test. Yeah.
But I didn't know that yet. I had to do the test first with the filter in front of it, because then I could see whenever a car headlight would hit the filter, I would see 4 lights going through the filter, and I didn't want that. So that's when I went to flashing. And so we pre-flashed the film. So Joey V would pre-flash everything in the lab and then give us the film, which is already partially exposed, so that it would make the blacks.
No, I remember well. I was working with him in the lab at that time, and I would actually go into high speed and watch the prints come through at the end of every shooting day. And the amount of testing that took place and the amount of experimentation and what in that era, which is to me, a time in my life that I cherish, because I was watching you and other artists work with testing with the support of a place like Technicolor and Joey, to be able to work creatively and to prepare for what you would do through a series of photochemical tests that you would do before shooting to come up with that exact look that you were going for. And it was a bit of a mad science race to start off with, because you had to get to that percentage of flashing and the exposure and have it just right.
Right. And that's why we would test so much more back then.
Yeah.
But also, every morning when I would be on my way to set in the morning, which was early, because Spike was an early bird, I'd have to be on set in the Bronx at 5:15. So at 4:30 in the morning, I was on the phone with Joey V. Joey V, for those of you who don't know him, Joey Violante was a legend over at
my old colleague.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you guys would be up at the crack of dawn and watching the film as it came out. And so I'd be on the phone with him, asking him, was the negative exposed all right? And he would oversee, what was called the timing, which is how the colors, what what colors were at play in the film. So they would add
and
red or
and
add
the
yellow.
timing lights also indicated exposure.
Correct.
And you had printer points from 0 to 60, and when you were up in the 30s, a little bit overexposed above mid 25, right?
Right.
And you were able to know where you had landed by getting the lights and then also getting his report back
Right, exactly.
every single day. Yeah.
Exactly. Every single morning, talk to him, And so one morning he called me, and this is, cell phones. This is when did we shoot Summer Sam? 1998. So one morning I get a call from Joey V at like 4 in the morning. I'd just gotten up after going to bed at 11 because we would go watch dailies every night until 11.
Which
I mean,
was such a
really-
great tradition to watch
Yeah.
projected film, right?
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, we would watch.
The print.
We would watch it every night. The entire crew, the key personnel on the crew,
With the
head of
with
wardrobe,
Spike.
the head of makeup, Spike, the gaffer, the camera assistants, the focus pullers. Everybody would go to watch the film together to see the work that they had done the day before, to evaluate, what was going on. That light was too hot, or that person missed the focus, and it would be a gathering, and it would be, we were a family, very much a family kind of thing.
And you were able to communicate about the day together and sitting together. It wasn't people looking at dailies on their iPhones or any of that stuff. It was a community of people talking about the work from the day before,
Yes.
projected in full film screen,
Right.
in the lab at that time, in the theater.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I remember being a young cinematographer and being terrified, that you screw it up and everybody is there to watch. But most of the time, when you get past the first few days and then everybody's together, it's exactly that. It was a community. And, the film community is still a community, but I think everybody who remembers that time misses that time. It was a time when, you have a bunch of artists who come together and everybody is problem solving together. Now it's so much more separated.
Right, because people are looking at things alone,
Yeah.
and then talking the next day. You don't really convene in a digital projection screening room to sit with the director, or like you did with film projection, looking at stuff.
Well, the reason why we don't do that anymore is because there's no time. And that's another thing that has really changed in film production is that, that we're working longer hours, much longer hours. The producers are trying to get much more out of the crew. I have to say it's become less enjoyable for a lot of the people in the film industry because now, the schedules are unrealistic. And especially, in episodic, they're expecting people to, in 10 days of shooting, to come up with these movies and to do things that, they came up with. There was an 8-day normal shooting schedule for
an hour. This is for an hour long.
For television shows, but that was when it was on one set and the set wouldn't change and just the words would change. So now, we're doing things where we're exploding cars and we're changing locations and we have stunts and you have special effects and you have this and you have that. And, I think that, it's getting to a point where, it's overflowing and, what I call the semantics of television production, where, now they don't want to say that they're doing more than 10 days because they don't want to set a precedent. So in doing that, they'll add a splinter day or, a splinter unit or a tandem unit or that kind of thing. And so, I'm just standing back and watching to see when it's going to tip over. It's becoming, to the point where it's dangerous. We're doing too many hours. And so that community
right.
feeling is lost. Now it's no longer about the making of film. It's about how much can you get done for the money
In a day, exactly. Let's rewind the clock back to a gentler time. Not necessarily all the way back to when you shot Angela, which of course I remember with Rebecca, and then films after. But I wanted to hit something I mean, I have great memories of Ballad of Jack and Rose because I remember being in the room when you were color correcting with Joe on that, and all of the progress that was made during production and watching it happen. But Personal Velocity was a bit of a marker for me in the film era because it was with Indigent, and Indigent was going against the tide and capturing everything on DV cam at the time. It wasn't even HD, am I right?
No, it wasn't even HD.
It was
Wasn't
standard.
even digital.
It was standard def tape, right?
It wasn't. It was. Yeah, it was.
It was not
tape.
It was not
No,
HD.
it was. It wasn't even. No. No.
It was, and I think
HD wasn't. I don't even know if HD was around then.
And they shot. I think was it that were you shooting 25 frame PAL or how were you doing it back then?
These were
So,
little. They
yeah.
were little amateur cameras.
Right.
Right. So if I remember, they're the PD 150s. Right.
Right.
So they were small
And that was
little
and that was
handycams.
and that was the mandate at the time because this was Indigent, and then later on there was a company called HDNet, which was much beyond that, where everything was a mandate to shoot in HD, and that was the Mark Cuban company. That was a totally separate entity, but this was Indigent that was sort of part of the IFC thing, and and Jake Abram, Gary Winnick. And it was a time where it was I would call it an early disruptor to film. It was like film had not gotten a shot in the arm because people were shooting film, but it was a statement being made that you could work creatively and use this tool at the time that there was a huge amount of film still being shot.
Well, part of the
Am I
thing
right
was
about that?
about quality
Right.
of, the quality of film. Like everybody would say, they would see the legitimacy of a film if it was shot in 35 or even in 16. So the
Right.
quality of the film was the barometer for how it rated as a film. And Indigent, which was short for Independent Digital Entertainment, was cooked up by Gary,
Gary Winnick,
right?
the late Gary Winnick.
The late Gary Winnick, who came up with this idea that, sometimes, artists want to just make stories and, so let's use the video medium, even if it isn't the best, at least you're getting your story down. So he created this group, and part of the idea was that let's give some actors who want to direct the opportunity to direct. Like they wouldn't normally have the money or the opportunity to direct. So they said, all right, you have to use these. They bought 2 PD 150s, which are little amateur cameras, right? And they said, we'll give you $150,000.
Right, low budget
and these
filmmaking.
2 cameras, and then you can go out and make a film, So they went to Rebecca Miller, who is the daughter of Arthur Miller, and Inga Marath, the photographer. And Rebecca and I had made a film on film together called Angela, right, which I won the cinematography award for at Sundance the second time.
That's 1995. This is back a ways. Yeah.
Yeah, actually 95.
Yeah.
95.
95. Yeah.
Yeah, 95.
Yeah.
So Rebecca came to me and she said, listen, I want to make this film. I wrote the script. The only thing is that we have to use it. We have to shoot it in digital, and we only have $150,000. And I was like, okay, and back then I think it was much more common, and even now I think for cinematographers to have long relationships with their directors, like Sven Nykvist and Bergman.
Yeah.
The Robbie Mueller, some Wim Wenders. So, there was, and I had that relationship very much with Rebecca. We could, we didn't have to talk very much. We could understand what each other were thinking. And so, obviously I wanted to work with Rebecca again. And I was like, well, why don't we shoot it in Super 16? Right. I'll work for free. Let's just shoot it in Super 16. Like, I did not want to shoot something in video.
With the PD 150.
With the PD 150, which was smush, right? Now, let's go back a step because I had already shot Bamboozled with Spike. right?
That's right.
So I already had shot Bamboozled, and
What was that shot
the
on?
thing the VX1000s,
That
right?
was a Panasonic.
That
right?
was Panasonic 1000s, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
The VX1000. Yeah.
And but those cameras, again, amateur cameras, just consumer cameras that people would shoot home videos on.
Right, because this is all before
Before digital.
before the digital development that had taken place to capture
All
high resolution.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're looking at little baby tapes. And the problem with the VX1000s is that the lenses weren't resolving well. So the reason why people value lenses is because of the way they're able to resolve detail. So on these lenses, if I went wide angle, it looked like it was out of focus, but it's just that the lens was like plastic. It looked like looking through plexiglass than looking through glass. So I was really not a fan of shooting personal velocity on digital. And she said, well, that's the way it is. I mean, we have to. So I thought, all right, I had to swallow my pride a little bit. And I said, all right. I said, right, so this is the way I'm going to think about this. This is what I said to myself. I thought, Rebecca wrote this script. It's 3 short stories, right? Personal Velocity is 3 short stories about 3 women. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to approach it like a short story. I'm not going to place the same expectations on this as I would a novel, right? A short story is a short story, and that's what it is. It is its own thing. And so I thought, I'm going to approach it with the same attitude. This is its own thing. I'm going to treat it like its own thing. And I'm not going to place expectations that it's going to be like some 35 millimeter film. It's just not. Right?
3 short films.
So 3 short films using a camera that I felt was compromised already. So I'm just going to accept that as a compromise. So then I decided, all right, how am I going to shoot this? Right? Because I had lessons from Bamboozled about what the pitfalls are of shooting with these kind of cameras. So I said to Rebecca, okay, I'm not going to do any wide angle shots. Sorry, I'm not doing them. I said, if we're going to do them, I have to do them on longer lenses and get back all the way. So, because the longer end of the film of the lens was always better. She said, okay. And I said, and also, I'm not shooting in any bright sunlight because the cameras also couldn't handle contrast.
Right, and
Right.
Yeah, right, and also I would imagine the lights would blow out a portion of the frame. Right, the highlights would have hyperluminance. Right.
Correct, because it's called dynamic range. So the dynamic range was very small. So, and the highlights, once they would blow out, they would just start becoming yellow and they'd start artifacting, which is really disgusting.
Exactly, and not to freeze frame on that for a moment, but all of these projects, correct me if I'm wrong, when you went through the process, ultimately you finished them and then you output to 35, correct? These were all made as prints
Right,
in the
exactly,
end, right?
which is-
So did you get a I can't remember. I can't remember because but I remember being around. Did you get a chance to test the outputs to film before you finished shooting?
Yes, I did that because I knew, as a cinematographer, that you don't only take care of, the immediate film. You have to take care of what the end product is. So you have to scrupulously test for your end product. What's your print stock? What is it? What is the print stock? What is the negative going to be from that? So you can make multiple copies. So you have to consider all of that all the way down the line. I mean, I used to go and look at dupe prints, print off the dupe neg to make sure that they were correct because, there was
That's
so
going to
much
be the
fun.
theatrical print in the end.
Correct.
Exactly.
That's what people would see. So, and I had to, maintain control over that. So anyway, so I tested for that. And interestingly, I decided that, people were giving me recommendations. They would say, oh, well, if you're going to shoot, you have to use the full chip. And you have to use these anamorphic adapters with the chip, which, by the way, you had to change if you were going from one focal length to the other. You'd have to put this attachment on the lens. I was like, I'm not doing that. I was like, I'm not doing that. That's
And
one more thing to distract me from what I'm doing.
And you composed 185, right? Was theatrical 185? Yeah.
Theatrical 185,
yeah.
right? So I thought, I'm not doing that because I'm not. I need to look at the monitor. I'm not going to do one more thing on top of this. I'm just not. I was like, it's already compromised medium. I'm just going to do what it is. So then the other thing I said is, because you couldn't see the focus on these little monitors on the flip out screens. I mean, we're talking about a 1x2 monitor, if that. I mean, nobody's eyes are that good, and nobody can see them. I mean, that was the big challenge with digital when it came out, is the focus, right? And this is before digital, so it's how can you see the focus on these tiny little monitors? So I said, okay, that's the other thing my other rule is that we have to focus on. I have to have a monitor, a regular monitor, next to this camera at all times. So I'd have a 13-inch monitor that I would drag around with me in the car, on set, and most of the time I was never looking at the action. I was operating while looking at the monitor. So the monitor, because I had to focus.
So you were camera operating
and
looking at the monitor, not looking, through a viewfinder.
Correct. At a separate monitor, not on this little screen. And I was focusing, because the other thing on these cameras is that you don't have a focus puller. You have to focus.
You have to manual focus.
Yeah, because there's no markings on the lenses. You have to focus. You have to feel the focus, right? And digital focus, those electronic focus, difference between digital focus and electronic focus. They were electronic lenses, so you have to focus electronically, which is
you have to turn off anything that could happen automatically because you were doing all manual focus.
Correct.
Of course, yeah,
Correct.
right,
and turn off everything. The light. The iris.
Right.
Everything had to be manual.
Everything had to be manual.
Right.
Yeah.
And so the other thing I did was I put film filters on these little cameras, because I tricked the white balance. I was constantly tricking the white balance to think it was one thing when it was another thing. And then I would put film filters on it to override it, because I wanted to change it. Because I realized that I may not have an opportunity to do any post on this because I had no money. So I thought I had to get the look in the camera as best I could.
That was the other question I was going to ask you back then. If my memory serves, you didn't get a chance to color correct digitally before outputting to film. You answer printed film after you outputted from the tape, or did you do a color? You did a grade prior to that and then output, correct?
I did. I was able to finally do a color correction on the tape.
On the tape, yeah.
It was on the tape. Remember, this is not digital, so it's an analog tape.
So you were
I was able to change some of the color.
You were able to. I think it was a Tape House at the time or something.
Yeah,
was with Joe?
Joe,
Yeah.
So going back to testing for the output, for the blow up, because at this time it was very, very early on that we were taking original tape, and putting it back onto film, because it was a tape to film out, which was just the technology was just being developed.
Yeah.
And I did one of the first tape to film outs with a film I did with Spike called Jim Brown All-American.
Right.
So I had already experienced what it was, and also on Bamboozled, where it was one of the first film to tape film outs.
Tape to film outs, yeah.
It was done at Swiss Effects in Switzerland.
That's right. Swiss Effects was doing it back then. I remember those guys.
So that was really rudimentary. It was in a tiny little back room of a film lab in Switzerland outside of Zurich.
Right.
Anyway, that's a whole other story.
That's a whole other
story. But anyway,
story.
So now by this time the Danes were doing film outs. So one of the things that technically is that there's this thing called the shutter, right? So in PAL, you would have the shutter would be at 1/25th.
Right.
Or 1/50th.
Right, of course.
Nominally in NTSC at 1/60th. Right. So everybody would shoot at 1/50th because then you get 2 fields per image or whatever it is, right? And I looked at 1/50th and I thought, yuck, this feels like video. I just hated it. So I started playing around with the shutter and I went to 1/25th and I was like, oh, this is much smoother.
So it was like almost like 25p, like progressive frames.
Almost, but they didn't have progressive at the time.
Right, but that didn't exist, right?
Right.
But PAL was set for 2025, and
Right.
and NTS
No, it was set for 150th.
for 150th, and then
It was 25
and
frames per second, so
yeah,
to speak,
yeah.
but 150th of a shutter.
And NTSC was 30 for 60, right?
Correct.
Yeah, right.
So
exactly.
I decided
yeah.
to shoot it at 1/25th of a shutter, which everybody thought was blasphemy. So I sent it off to these different labs to check it, and the lab, which was considered the best, I guess it was in Denmark, calls me back up, and they're like, "Why do you want to do this? You're only getting one field, and you have to double the amount of information in order to, do the film out." And I was like, "Well, then we'll just double the information." And he said, "But it's not the same information. You get more, you're getting more detail." I go, "How much more detail are we talking? I mean, we're talking such a minuscule amount of detail. It's not worth feeling I wanted, it's the 1/25th slowed it down so slightly, it felt more cinematic to me than filmic." And they're like, "You're crazy." And I was like, "Call me crazy. I'm going to do it." Right. So after all of this, after I trick the white balance, I put film filters on it, I do the 16:9 framing in the camera because I don't want to be distracted by all the other bullshit. And I finish the film with Rebecca. We do the grade. We finish it. We send it to Sundance, and then it wins the best cinematography at Sundance.
Crazy.
Right.
Right? And this is like, and competing against all these other projects, all of
Film.
them shot on film.
Yeah.
Yeah. I love it. I love it.
So I had to laugh because everybody said to me, they like, "Oh, it's so beautiful. How did you do that? How did you make it?" And I said, "Because I didn't listen to anybody." Right? I mean, it really said to me, I followed my intuition. I followed I was looking for how it felt, rather than going according to what I should do, quote unquote. And that's what I've always done that, and I think that's lent a lot of success to my career.
Yeah.
Is to follow the little voice on my shoulder,
Right. Right. And going back in time, we couldn't even go through your whole world of Terrence Malick, Jim Jarmusch, Sam Mendes, Jonathan Demme, all of the people that you've worked with. But I'd like to go into a film that I remember that you shot with for Jim, Coffee and Cigarettes, and talk a little bit about that, because that one I remember a little bit about what the producers went through and what it went through in distribution, because I believe Jason Cleo was involved, and there was some complexity of dealing with making a black and white print in the end and all of that, and whether or not to print a color stock or not. There were Kodak issues, and you had a journey to make this absolutely cool film as a black and white finish. Can you talk about what it was like making that film with Jim?
Well, I was really excited to work with Jim because, we come from the same world in New York, and he, came to me through a friend of mine. He had known about Swoon for many years. And so I was really excited to shoot black and white again because, in Swoon, we shot black and white negative, and we printed on black and white print stock.
Which was really one of your first big independents, right? Swoon was, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it was kind of the film that people came to know me about. Besides Samsara, actually, that film in Cambodia,
right,
won 25 international awards.
Right.
I won the Student Academy Award for it.
Right.
And so, that was kind of a film that people started to know me. But Swoon was the first time I ever did anything dramatic, and it was the first time I ever shot black and white. I mean,
and then you worked with Tom Kalin on multiple times, of course.
Yeah. Right after that,
yeah.
We did Jeffrey Bean in black and white.
Right.
Again. So, I knew about how to shoot black and white, and because again, I followed a different tact. I wasn't exposing for the shadows; I was exposing for the highlights in black and white, and everybody had done differently. Also, through the blow up process, I learned blowing up treated the black start to be treated differently, and the whites start to halate in a really beautiful way.
And you shot in black and white 16 millimeter negative, right?
In Swoon, yes,
in
because
Swoon.
we had no money. Everybody was getting $100 a day from the PAs to everybody.
And that was shot not at that time, not super 16 single perf, but shot double perforated 16.
Correct. It was
And then-
my personal Arri SR2 that I had bought before I went to Cambodia. And I used 2 lenses.
And was it composed 4.3? I can't remember. Was that was composed
No,
at 185?
No, 133.
133. So you did do 1.3.
Yeah, 133, and then we had to because we didn't know it was become a movie. We thought it was going to be an art film.
Right. So you shot it with the 1:3 aspect ratio for what would be a 4:3 delivery. Yeah,
Correct.
TV. Yeah.
And then we had to go back and they didn't have Pan-scan at the time because there was no video. I mean, there was, that didn't exist back then. We did an optical.
Yeah, you had to do an optical blow up.
Correct. Right.
I remember the guys that did it. I don't remember who did Swoon, but I knew the people at the time. John Alanya in the effects house, and Mo Weissman at Eastern Optical Effects, and
Right.
I can't even remember. Balaj Nairi at Cineric, all these guys did that
We
stuff.
did this at Alpha Cine. So
At Alpha Cine in Seattle.
in Seattle did Swoon. Right. So anyway, going back to Coffee and Cigarettes.
Coffee and cigarettes, yeah.
We were not shooting with regular 16 at that point. I think we shot it on 35.
You shot that on 35, yeah.
And but again, brought the same approach in terms of black and white and shooting black and white. But you're right that the big question afterwards was
How to release the film theatrically on print, making
Correct.
release prints.
because they weren't printing on black and white print stock anymore.
That's correct.
So the print stock really makes a difference in what the finished product is. So of course, Jim was very adamant because printing on black and white was a pure way to print black and white negative, right? So when you go to color, I mean, at the color you have to make the black and the white with color, and as we know, white is all the colors, and so you have to find the right balance for it to feel like black and
it's
white.
hard. I mean, it's hard to. There are many projects that have integrated black and white sections, and you would have to find a way to nail perfect balance without a hue or a cast over it, either a cyan blue or a warm cast that would go over it. But to create a natively pure black and white image on a color stock. Very, very. There's a tiny sweet spot for that.
Exactly, and Jim had come from Stranger Than Paradise,
Right.
which of course was shot on
Black and white.
of
course.
negative, printed on black and white stock.
Yes.
So everybody, in the film world, when we were in the film world, and then when things went digital, but you still had to print. So when we were still projecting films in the theater,
Yeah,
everybody still had to consider what the print stock was. And
that's correct.
so I raised hell when Kodak changed the print stock in the middle of Summer of Sam. So I don't know if you remember that.
I do.
But so
Well, there was Vision and Premiere, and there were
Correct.
different color stocks. Yeah,
Right,
And please jog my memory on where you were in the transition for that.
I was beside myself because when we were shooting Summer of Sam, I was shooting for a certain print stock. So cinematographers would shoot on negative, but you would know what your print stock would bear.
So if you were
you'd
going to go to
know-
Premiere, it would have to be you would want to release print in Premiere.
Right.
Right.
But what that means technically is that so the blacks had a certain density and the colors had a certain density. So you would shoot for that. So I would know that it's a very contrasty film stock. So I need to put more light in the shadows so that when I print it, I can actually see the detail. But so in the middle of Summer of Sam, what happened is that Kodak, because 7 had come out and Darius Kanji had shot 7 and made it very, very contrasty, and everybody loved it, Kodak decides, we're going to change the print stock and we're going to make it much more contrasty. And I flipped out. I was like, wait a minute, because I was in the middle of shooting Summer of Sam, and all of a sudden they're going to change the print stock. And all of a sudden I have to change. It would change everything that I was doing. I mean, I couldn't stop in the middle, because if I stopped in the middle, I mean, half of the film would be too contrasty, and it wouldn't be the same movie. And it changes the whole movie. So I called up Joey V at Technicolor, and I said to Joey V, what was it? Was it 608? What was the name of the print stock? I can't remember, 806 or 608. Anyway, there's a certain print stock.
Started with the number 52.
52.
Yeah. And then, because of the 35.
So I said to him, I want you to take as much of that film stock that you still have left, and I want you to put it aside for me. Because I need to, when I do my final prints, I need that print stock.
Right.
That's what I'm going to use.
And in the theatrical world, when we would print, the first exhibition prints were called show prints. And the show prints were for the premiere, and they were for the top urban market locations. And then the volume release would go out on the stock of choice from the distributor, which one would hope would be the stock that you wanted creatively. But back in the day, there were opportunities to print on AGFA, there were opportunities to print on Fuji, and on more than one Kodak type stock.
Right,
Yeah.
the cheaper stocks
Right,
or whatever,
right.
Obviously they could, the cheaper. So what ended up happening is that because I knew that when I wanted to make my what was called answer prints,
Yes.
which would be when we'd cut the negative together, and then you would make a print, and I would have to work with the film timer to decide what the final look is going to be.
And you'd have to
what
make
colors,
the
whether
changes.
it's going to be warmer or cooler. Every shot had to be separately timed. So while the film was running, so you'd have to do it really quickly when the film was running. It was real art. So he saved the print stock for me, and when I printed, well, first of all, the first answer print I got back, I was like, okay, we have to print everything up, because remember, everybody would think of printing down the blacks. So I had to bring everything up, because I was trying to make it look like it was humid. So
Right.
I wanted the blacks to be up.
So
that was the first thing.
you wanted to raise the luminance, raise the brightness. So yeah, right.
So then we printed on the stock that I wanted, and we got the look that I wanted. And Joey V and I got the film to a place that was really beautiful. And so then we had to go to the release prints. And
Well, you'd have to make an interpositive first once you were finished with the answer print.
correct.
And then
an internegative.
And then internegative, and then you'd make prints off the internegative. Fortunately, the show prints, when a distributor was kind enough, could be made for the premiere off of the original to the stock of choice, in theory. I don't know what happened. You tell me the rest of the story.
We only had enough stock for a few prints. So Disney was releasing the film, and Disney had a deal with Kodak. And basically it was that they had a deal where all Disney prints would be Kodak. And I said to them, I'm not printing on Kodak, because the Kodak's print stock is too dark. I'm going to print on Fuji. And they flipped out. They said, no way, you're not printing on Fuji. And obviously at this time, it was a really big competition between Kodak and Fuji. Fuji was not very popular at the time, but it was starting to be, because the print stock was really interesting. So I was becoming the renegade, and I was like, I'm not printing on Kodak, I'm going to print on Fuji. And I told Spike, I said, Spike, they're going to try and make me do this. I'm not doing it. And he's totally supported me, but here I was. I had the entire studio.
You were fighting. You were fighting the studio's contract with Kodak.
Correct. So I went to L.A. and
Probably
I
ended
said,
up at
all right, I got to go to
Technicolor.
L.A. and I said, okay. They said, oh, it's the same. It's the same. And I go, it's not the same. It's not the same. I said the Fuji print is much better because it's less contrasty, and that's the look I'm looking for. The Kodak print stock is too contrasty at the time, and they were like, no, it's the same. I go, fine. I said, I'll show you. So I invited all the suits into the screening room. I can't believe I did this. I was the only girl. 20 guys in suits from Disney. I love this.
This is great.
So and I'm like, okay, so I get in there and I'm like, okay. I go, I totally hear what you guys say. I said, but let's look at it. And so I said to the projectionist, I said, I want you to run it side by side. All right. And I said, okay.
Which, of course, they could do because they had the lens set up to go onto the
Correct.
screen.
And they knew they could do side by side. So I said, okay, so now I want you to run on the left side. I said, the film that I have time, this is the look that I want, okay? And I said, on the right side, I want you to run the Kodak print that they've made off of this so we can see it. And I said to the guys, okay, so you tell me if it's the same. I said, ready? Okay, good. So we ran the film for like 5 minutes, and I stop it, and the lights go on, and I'm like, so, what do you guys think? And they go, it's not the same. I was like, okay, great. So now where do we go? I said, let me run the Fuji print. They ran the Fuji print, and I said, so, and they're like, you're right. It's very close. And I said, yeah. So that's why I want to do it on the Fuji print. And they're like, well, we can't.
Yeah, because they had a contract obligation. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And I'm like, well, the artistic versus your obligation, the art versus commerce here, guys. Right. And they laughed.
Yeah.
And I said, so what are we going to do? And so that's when you have your technical guys. The film timer came and said to me, he goes, well, this is what I could suggest. Why don't we flash the internegative and bring up the blacks, and then we could
So you would lower the contrast
by
by
on
flashing.
the negative
Right.
by bringing up the shadow areas. And then we can also, we can also flash the print stock, and we can see which one works better. And that's what we did. And so we came to a compromise. But I have to say,
And you had to get there with Kodak stock, but you found a photochemical solution by flashing I'm assuming the internegative, because the print would have been a disaster to run release prints. Right. I know, than the factory of it all. Yeah.
And all those guys came to me and they said, listen, we really appreciate your way of doing this because you didn't scream and you yelled. I could have thrown a temper tantrum, but it's not my way. I'm more like, let's show you first, then you agree, and then let's figure it out. So that's always been my way too. I don't throw temper tantrums. I don't believe in it. I don't believe in screaming at people. I don't think it gets you anywhere. And I don't believe in being an asshole on set or off a set. I really don't think it makes you a better filmmaker.
No. You're with the way you managed it was so perfect because it was the proof is in what you see.
Right.
It's like, what's there's no argument in that. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. Back to we did a little sidetrack with Spike because we love that, but back to coffee and cigarettes again, and the black and white and all of that, because that was a real challenge to go through that process. Do you remember the story of how that went through in the end? Because I think in the end they had to fight that too to make that work, right?
Right.
Because I think in the end they bought black and white stock to print, and then it didn't work out, and then they had to run it on color print stock and make it look as good as they could and as balanced as they could as a black and white image from what would have been probably, I'm guessing, a color internegative made through the black and white answer print process.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So they had to apply a different process to it to get it closer to black and white. So that was the thing. And that, when we think back to that time, because we were in the photochemical world, we had to do things physically. It was a physical process, as opposed to now, which is digital, which is, it's crazy to think how far we've come in such a short amount of time.
Yeah.
The digital process allows us to work within the image. When we were in photochemical and physical, you could only work
overall.
The image was overall. You couldn't fix anything or do creative other things within the image. And for me, when we first started going to digital intermediates, that is when you take a film original negative and transfer it
and scan it
electronically. Mm-hmm. Right. Transfer it electronically first, and then when we came into digital process, they would scan it. Right. So that was another development that you could actually manipulate the image within the image. So
Inside the frame.
Exactly. So I'd take the shadows and make color in the shadows, or I could make them darker, or I could bring them up. And I mean, that whole process has advanced so much in the past 10 years. I mean, even the past 8 years. I mean, it's phenomenal now what we can do. So Eternal Sunshine, we actually did as a digital intermediate.
You did it as a DI, and that was actually quite relatively early in the journey of what would become the norm.
That's right.
Right.
That's right.
That was early DI.
Right. Very, very early DI. We actually did it in 4K, which was highly unusual.
Unheard
at
of
the time.
at that time.
Unheard of. Right. So we had to do it in 2.2K because you couldn't even see it in 4K. So we would do our
the
corrections.
Processing power wasn't there yet.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. We didn't have the processing power. You couldn't see it immediately. So we'd have to do our changes, and then we'd only see it the next morning because I'd have to spend all night rendering it. So, it's a very changed world.
Yeah, I mean, now it's just instantaneous what you get back. And through all of this, right, you've had the chance, when I think of all of this, you've had the chance now to share your knowledge as an educator, right? You've taught a little bit, right? When you get a chance to, right?
Well, Spike will ask me to come in and speak to his class. I'll go and speak in Tom's Columbia University class. I try to pass on the knowledge as much as I can. I mean, I'm a believer in shared knowledge and embracing people who are trying to learn. I think it's really important. I'm not ready to go into the world of academia.
No, not as a career commitment at this point in time. Yeah. I'm fascinated by something that I read. We know each other a lot of years, and I did not realize, although we were at Cambodia in Poland together at the same time, I didn't know that you had you actually attempted to attend the film school in Łódź in Poland as a place to go to school. Yeah. Or is that, tell me, because I don't know that story. We've never talked about it. So tell me that story. I'm fascinated.
Yeah, well, that was a very long time ago.
Because you have Polish roots in your family.
Exactly.
And was there Polish spoken at home when you were a kid? Did you learn the language at all? Or
my parents could speak Polish. They spoke Polish in their houses, but not in our house. My grandparents spoke Polish. I could hardly speak to them when I was growing up. I mean, I always heard Polish in my house when I was growing up.
So you had heard it all your life. You didn't learn it as a.
Yeah. So I started taking Polish because when I was in my last year at Brown, I had heard about the school in Łódź, and I knew that it was one of the best film schools in the world.
For cinematography, exemplary. Right.
So many cinematographers have come out of that school. Janusz Kaminski.
Hoyte van Hoytem.
Did Hoyte go to
Hoyte went there. You know Hoyte.
I didn't know that.
Yes, he
Really?
did. Yeah. In fact, I met Hoyte at Cambodia before he shot the Fighter for David O. Russell, which he shot to perf. It was crazy, but wild, but beautiful. And I had met him at Cambodia before that, and then he came and we worked with him in the lab. He studied there, and he now lives in Stockholm. But he went to school in Poland and is a native originally of Amsterdam. He's Dutch. But Pavel Edelman, Janusz Kaminski, all these fantastic, Andrzej Barkowiak, of course, right? All these famous, emblematic Polish cinematographers and European cinematographers that came from all over to study there. Yeah. And my understanding is that the people that went there, when I like to think of like, if you learn the camera at the school in Poland, you learn the mechanics of the inside of the camera, all of the parts and the machining and all of the things that you learn about the camera the way an auto mechanic learns about a car. you know, you really understand everything about the body and about the mechanics and the machine of the camera. And then you also study all of the photo optics and everything else that goes with it, right?
Yeah,
So
it's
like
very scientific.
very
at
scientific,
first.
right?
Yeah, very much so. And when I was in France, I was so embedded in the theoretical. I really wanted to get my hands on the camera. I wanted to actually do it. I wanted to study the practical. So when I was in my last year at school at Brown, I applied for a Fulbright grant, which I got. So I was awarded a Fulbright grant to go to Poland to study at the film school in Łódź. And I started taking Polish with the librarian at Brown.
Oh, my
who
God.
was a linguist.
What a
And-
great story.
Yeah.
This is fantastic. This is something I never knew. Keep going.
Well, it wasn't. It was kind of a librarian. He was the guy who would check out the books to make sure you weren't stealing them. So it was this old guy. His name was Eli Adlerman, and he, came from Odessa, Russia. And I started talking to him. I don't know. I started probably joking with him as I was checking out my books, and turns out that he was a linguist. And in the old days, and so I started taking Polish lessons with him, with the intention to go to Poland. And then martial law fell, and I couldn't go to Poland because it was impossible to do anything in Polish. At the
So
time
that
of
was
martial law.
that was the block.
That's the reason why I didn't go. Pretty wild.
The story.
Yeah.
The story. When you went to, I can't remember when we were at Cameronage, that was still in Łódź, right? Or was it already in Bydgoszcz? I can't even remember because I went all the years going back to when it was in Łódź and then to
Well, the
Bydgoszcz.
first time I went, it was in Toruń.
In Toruń,
which
yeah.
is very in the north, which is an old medieval town.
And it's back there again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Which is a great old town. It's freezing cold there in the winter. But the first time I went, it was very much still under the communist veil. Poland was deep set behind the Iron Curtain. So after my Fulbright grant to go to Poland, I changed it. I reapplied, and I got it to go to Romania because there was something crazy in me that wanted to experience what life was like behind the Iron Curtain, which I was out of my mind. Because at that time, it was in the early 80s when Ceausescu was at the height of his horribleness. But I had heard that there was a cache of a whole group of interwar photos that were done between the world wars. It was the rise of socialism in Europe, and it was in the library in Bucharest.
In Bucharest, yeah.
And so I was going to put together an exhibition for the ICP. So I
Fantastic. What a great story this is. Keep going.
So I was waiting for my visa to come through with the Romanian government. And so I sold my car thinking that I was going to go to Romania for a year and, move back into my parents' house outside of New York City, and was waiting. So 1 month went by, another 2 months went by. And finally, I realized that they weren't going to give me my visa because Romania was not allowing the Jews to emigrate to Israel without paying for their whole education. So the United States withdrew most favored trade status. And so they stopped all kind of cultural exchange. So that's the point where I decided I would go into film. Because I thought, all right, because it was about photography. And I thought, all right, I'm going to actually start doing this. So that's when I started taking a Super 8 class in New York City. That kind of kicked it off.
Where was that? Was that at NY? Where did
Somebody's loft on Chambers Street.
For real?
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. And then that led to the nights at NYU
that led to me being asked if I wanted to be an editor of a documentary.
Right.
And I went to go and interview with this woman, and she was willing to hire me. I went at the recommendation of the person who was teaching the Super 8 class, and I said to her, I would love to do this. I said, but I don't have the technical knowledge to do this. I said, why don't I work on the film, but in a different capacity? So I became the associate producer, and I organized all of the voiceover sessions. I organized, I oversaw all the post-production process and everything, the film negative and all of that kind of stuff. When they were doing negative cutting on an upright moviola. I mean, how long ago was that?
Yeah, it was they were working with the print editing, work print editing on the upright moviola, and then you had negative cutters like Stan Zaba and all those other guys.
Stan Zaba.
Stan Zaba was one of the many negative cutters, including Noel Penrad and others that worked in New York in the era, and that was that became something that really embraced technology later on. But at that time, it was you were counting frames or key code numbers of against the perforations, and matching them up against the print that had the same numbers.
Yeah, back in those days, film was a much more physical act.
Very physical.
It was all about using your hands and using your eyes, and that's changed a lot. I mean, we still do that in certain ways, but it's more removed.
Yeah,
we can't touch it.
You can't touch it anymore, and you had film hanging in bins and assembling on a steam back, and then playing back on a with a flatbed with multiple tracks and everything. Yeah, it was very visceral. Yeah.
It was very visceral, and that leads to the idea of preservation. So, the fact that we can go back and look at some of those films from years and years ago is because the negatives still exist. Right. And so
negative lives on.
Yeah. I mean, that was a big issue when digital first came around was, how are we going to preserve the so-called negative? Are we going to keep it on hard drives? The technology keeps on changing, and everybody knows now is that how are we going to store this? Also, all the millions of pictures that you have on your iPhone, are you ever going to print them? Are you ever going to get off the cloud? I mean, what's going to happen if the cloud bursts? You're going to lose all of those pictures.
Or in this case, if the data center goes down, which is effectively what the cloud becomes. Yeah, is what cloud is. Yeah,
right.
It's a massive remote data center with all of our belongings in it. Right. We used to vault a negative in a lab vault, and then ultimately in bonded storage or out at one of the many storage facilities in New Jersey. And that the labs use as remote storage. And now we have our remote storage is a digital storage in the cloud in a place that we don't know. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the Academy, and I'm a member of the Academy for a long time, and one of the biggest concerns of the Academy was how to preserve future film.
The archive.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's a fitting end.
Well,
right? How to preserve future film.
So.
Boom.
He's just going to turn off the beeping light. Yeah. No. It's true. The Academy has made a mandate to make archive negatives, and and what was in the studio requirement of the YCM, which of course was a standard for the 3-strip backup of the original. There were all kinds of archival methods that were required by studios, but really at this point, just having an output negative stored properly in the proper temperature is the right thing to do, to store something in perpetuity with its tracks. Yeah,
that's the one reason why when I finished my film back in 2008, which, because I had it on so many different formats, I had, regular 16, I had a couple of 35 elements, I had blown up Super 8 to 16, and then I had some high 8 and, various different mediums from over the years.
You had multiple formats, so you can converge it all as a 35 negative in the end.
Well, I first had to up-res it and transfer it to HDSR. So I went to the highest quality HD I could. Then I posted it all in digital. Then I went back and made a film negative off of that, and made a film print.
Exactly.
So I have a film print and film negative, which is in the Academy right now. It's in storage.
As an archive of your work.
As an archive, right, exactly. And I have prints of Summer of Sam, a print of Eternal Sunshine, the labs used to do that.
You
They
hold,
would make a
they would make
gift
a
of it.
print. You would hold a print of your own.
Yes, yeah. They used to gift the DP a print. Prints are not cheap.
No, they're
They would
not.
give the DP a print, so I put all of my prints in storage at the Academy.
Oh, you did.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have all of your filmography archive of your prints in the Academy.
Yeah, whatever
Yeah,
film prints I have.
you have? Yeah,
Yeah,
you store them there,
yeah.
which is wonderful. Yeah, the legacy of film. It and now I mean what I love is revival, isn't it? Right? I mean with all the film that's shooting. Oh my
Yeah, a
God!
lot of people are shooting film.
I mean, everybody thinks like it's just Spielberg shooting and Scorsese getting to shoot and Chris Nolan, but Noah Baumbach, Marriage Story, shot on 35. Wow, all of a sudden, everyone's like head is turning, like people are taking advantage of the revival and the availability. There's a lab now in New York. Tony's out there running that with Bob and what's left of the people that used to work with me when I was a technical, or the processors and all that. And there's still one lab left in LA. Photochem's still there.
Yeah, Photochem is still there. And
Yeah.
the same daily supervisor is still there, Mart Horn.
They're still there. And then in London, you still have, you have Cinelab. I got a chance to work with them when I worked with Darius on Lost City of Z, and we processed all the negative there. And it's like, film is not, it hasn't gone away. And I what I found interesting was, I can't remember who it was recently that was talking about a class that they teach, but there are certain programs where they're still teaching to shoot film, which is wonderful. There's still education for cinematography on film. It's not all gone.
Well, I think
Yeah.
it's important because
Yeah.
it's
A
a
tool.
way of looking. It's a way of seeing and thinking about contrast and color, and important because working so much in digital now, one tends to just rely upon the monitor, but it doesn't leave a lot of discovery.
Yeah.
The
The
or
magic.
understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The organic part of the process is gone. Yeah. And it's and I like to think of it as like, all the tools in the toolbox, right? And that's one of them. It was like when I used to work with Errol and we did Mr. Death, and he shot VHS, black and white infrared, 35 color negative, 16 millimeter, some Super 8. It was total madness. And they output all the elements to 35 at that time that we did that film, and cut the negative and then answer print it. And they were okay with it looking musty and uncorrected from the VHS output. They probably treated it a little bit, but that was it. And it was like, and they had to assemble it all as film. And that process of physically creating the film element was beautiful, and then having a film archive in the end. But today I used to say when film started to go away, and someone would ask, well, what do you feel about the business? I said, well, we used to be in the film business. Now we're in the storage business, the digital storage business. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of data, and we store a lot of data, and there's so much recording and rolling going on. Because when you shot film, you had to think about how much you shot, right?
Yeah.
And that was another part of the process, right? There were limitations.
Yeah, very much. I think that people had to be much more specific about what they would film.
Map it out.
You just didn't. You had to really think about it, and you had to be economical about when you were rolling.
Yeah.
That's definitely a change thing now.
Yeah.
That's for sure. Well, it also has to do with feeling confident in what you're doing, and also point of view.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this has been absolutely spectacular. Thank you. I mean, we could talk for another 2 hours. So this was great, and for me, the whole idea of the transitions that you've been through, because you've gone from an era of film to a complete era of the digital capture world, but also an era where distribution is almost entirely going through streaming networks and where stuff ends up. And one of the things that you said, which I loved, was you were not always engaged with television because of what you felt was a lack of creativity. But now there is visual creativity in broadcast television, and there is a lot of really incredible conceiving that's going on, right?
Yeah,
and
very
and
much
and
so.
yeah, and it makes a difference, and it allows all the people that are in it to have an open playing field to do all of the different. And I don't want to use the dead word of calling everything content, because it's not just content. It's episodic television, it's theatrical film, it's short format and long format. But at the end of the day, we're telling stories, and the creativity has and also the masters like yourself have been able to work in all these arenas and bring beauty into it, right? Which really
That's
makes a
right.
difference. Yeah.
It does. It is about telling stories, and it is about, not only creating content, and that's kind of key. Is, how can we make meaningful stories today that are meaningful for our lives, and help guide us in being better human beings and making the world a better place. And that's kind of what I'm about. Is like, how do we describe the human condition and where we're at and where we're going? And those are the kind of the stories that I'm interested in, not just entertaining people that this happens and then that happens. I mean, that's not interesting to me as a storyteller.
Yeah.
I want to make
Yeah.
a difference.
Well, thank you. And I really appreciate you coming by tonight, and this has been fantastic. And thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks, Charlie.
Mwah.